He was a pioneer, a remnant of an era when meteorological science was measured in the mud on your tires and the crackling static of an AM radio. For over 4 decades, he had been one of the storm chasers, a small fraternity of scientists and adventurers who drove toward the black horizon to understand nature's most violent secrets. He had seen green skies, funnel clouds that formed and dissipated like ghosts, and felt the ground tremble with the power of tornadoes that could wipe a town off the map in minutes. He had lost friends to these monsters, men and women who, like him, believed that knowledge was worth the risk. It was this cost, etched into his face and his soul, that drove him out of the field. He vowed to find a better way, a method to look into the eye of the storm without sacrificing more human lives on the altar of discovery. The question that consumed him was simple, yet profound. How can you map hell without having to walk through its flames? The answer lay not in a more armored vehicle or a faster radar, but in an entirely new realm. For the next 15 years, he became a recluse, trading the open skies of Kansas for endless nights lit only by the glow of a computer monitor. He taught himself the language of machines, building, line by line of code, what would become his masterpiece. It was not just a program, it was a nascent mind, an artificial intelligence designed specifically to think like a storm. He fed it every piece of tornado data ever recorded, every atmospheric variable, every tragedy and near miss from his own career. He taught it to see patterns that the human eye, limited by speed and fear, could never perceive. He called it, privately, the Oracle. It was the culmination of his life, the fusion of his real-world experience with the boundless power of digital processing. It was, he believed, the invention that would make storm chasing obsolete and save the next generation of scientists from the fate of his friends. When his creation grew too powerful for his garage laboratory, he brought it to the institute he helped found. In those days, it was a place devoted to pure science. But institutions, like organisms, change. Funding models shifted, the old guard retired, and a new board of directors took control. With them came a young, ambitious director, a man with a business degree and a flair for marketing, but who had never smelled the ozone before a thunderstorm. The institute was rebranded, given a sleek new logo and a glossy corporate motto. Science became a product, discoveries became deliverables, and raw data was overshadowed by the need for compelling narratives. The meeting rooms, once filled with heated scientific debate, now echoed with buzzwords like synergy, optimization, and media impact. What happens when a search for the truth is replaced by a search for attention? The Oracle was renamed Project Typhoon, and the old scientist was relegated to a senior consultant role. He watched in silence as his creation was paraded before investors and journalists, the director speaking eloquently about his team and his vision for the future of meteorology. The scientist's suggestions in meetings were met with patronizing smiles and vague promises. His warnings about the risks of pushing the system beyond its safety limits were dismissed as the overcautiousness of a man from a bygone era. The stage for the conflict was set, a silent collision of two worldviews. On one side, a man who understood the terrifying power of a storm because he had faced it. On the other, a man who saw the storm only as an image on a screen, an opportunity for glory. The question lingered in the climate-controlled air of the control room. When the Rayal storm arrived, which philosophy would prevail? The day of the storm arrived not with the solemnity of a scientific endeavor, but with the electric hum of a premiere. The new control room, a cavernous space of dark glass and cool metal that he had designed for collaboration but now felt like a theater, was a hive of carefully managed activity. Media personnel from major networks had set up their cameras along a designated back wall, their lenses trained on the massive central screen. Investors in sharp, tailored suits milled about a catered breakfast bar, sipping expensive coffee while making small talk. It felt less like a mission to confront a dangerous natural phenomenon and more like a product launch. At the center of this choreographed spectacle, the director moved with the polished confidence of a showman, a wireless microphone clipped to his lapel. He gave sound bites to journalists, explaining the sophisticated graphics on the main screen with a practiced ease. The storm itself, a massive supercell brewing 300 miles away in the desolate plains, felt less like a threat and more like a co-star in his meticulously crafted performance. The scientist stood in the corner, a living ghost amidst the gleaming technology he had birthed. He was an analog man in a digital world, a footnote in the story of his own creation. The young technicians, many of whom had studied his published papers in university, offered him respectful nods, but their eyes quickly darted away, fearful of being associated with the past when the future was so aggressively on display. He was a relic, and the director, in the moments leading up to the launch, would make that painfully clear. The directive came down just an hour before the drones were scheduled to take flight. The director pulled him aside, away from the cameras, his voice a low, almost apologetic murmur that failed to mask its steely condescension. "The investors," he began, gesturing vaguely towards the smiling men with a nod of his head, "they want to see the new team in action. It's about presenting a forward-thinking image, a clean break with the old ways." He explained that the scientist's presence on the command team, while deeply respected for his foundational work, might send a mixed message. It was an image of the past, not the future. His very presence, his age, his cautious and methodical reputation, was deemed inappropriate for the dynamic, fast-moving narrative they were trying to build. What is the weight of a lifetime of experience against the polished narrative of a press release? The director offered him a comfortable chair in the VIP visitors gallery, a glass-walled room overlooking the control center. He could watch the show, but he could not be a part of it. He would be an audience to his own legacy. The scientist looked past the director's carefully arranged expression of sympathy and at the main screen, where the image of the swirling supercell pulsed like a living thing. That was the reality. This was theater. He simply nodded. There was no argument to be had, no point to be made that hadn't already been ignored in countless meetings. To argue would be to show he was emotionally invested, a flaw in this new world of detached, corporate science. He turned and walked towards the exit, his footsteps silent on the sound-dampening floor. He passed the server racks humming with the mind he had built, the workstations displaying data he had taught the system to see. He walked out of the control room, the automatic doors hissing shut behind him, each quiet sound a final, stinging insult. How does a creator feel when he is made a stranger in his own house? The betrayal was not a loud, dramatic event with shouting and anger. It was a quiet, polite, and thoroughly modern execution, carried out with a smile and a handshake, leaving not a scar, but a void. He did not go to the visitors' gallery to watch the performance. To do so would be to accept his new role as a spectator, a thought he could not stomach. Instead, he took the service elevator down to the archives, a quiet, forgotten level of the institute where the air was cool and smelled of old paper and history. He navigated the dimly lit corridors until he found it, his old office. It was a small, windowless room, a time capsule from a different era of the institution's life. While the floors above were all glass and open-plan spaces, this room was cluttered and personal. Books on fluid dynamics and advanced thermodynamics, filled with his own handwritten notes, were crammed into overflowing shelves. Faded photographs were tacked to a corkboard, showing younger versions of himself with old colleagues, their faces beaming in front of menacing storm clouds, some of those faces now just memories. A chalkboard, long since replaced by smartboards upstairs, was still covered in a ghost of complex differential equations, the last problem he had been working on before his world was rebranded. This room was his sanctuary, a place of substance in a building that had become obsessed with style. He sat at his old, decommissioned terminal, its plastic casing yellowed with age, and powered it on. The green monochrome text that flickered to life felt like a welcome from an old friend. This machine was not part of the Institute's main network. It was a ghost, a relic he had kept operational for his own purposes, connected to the AI's core architecture through a secure, encrypted maintenance port he had built into the system's foundation. In a war of ideas, must the first shot be loud? Or can it be a few quiet lines of code, a whisper in the heart of the machine? He began to type, his fingers moving with a familiar, practiced rhythm across the clattering keyboard. This was not the act of a bitter man committing sabotage. It was the act of a creator protecting his creation from itself, and from the arrogant men who now claimed to control it. The commands he entered were a complex sequence, a digital key known only to him. He was accessing a dormant section of the AI's programming, a series of subroutines he had designed years ago as a philosophical failsafe. He had named it the Auto-Preservation Protocol. It was not a kill switch designed to crash the system. It was a governor, a digital conscience. When activated, the protocol's logic would subtly but irrevocably alter the AI's decision-making matrix. The prime directive would no longer be to capture the most visually spectacular or high-risk data. Instead, the AI would prioritize, above all else, the long-term survival of its drone fleet and the methodical acquisition of comprehensive, wide-area atmospheric data. It would trade the money shot from inside a tornado's vortex for the less glamorous, but infinitely more valuable, complete data set of the entire supercell. It would force the AI to behave not like a daredevil, but like a true scientist, patient, thorough, and wisely cautious. As he typed the final command and hit enter, the screen flashed a single, understated word in green text: active. He felt no thrill of victory, no rush of adrenaline. He felt only a quiet, somber sense of necessity. He had built a leash into the heart of his beast, not to harm it, but to keep it from being driven off a cliff by reckless masters. Upstairs, in the gleaming control room, the show was about to begin. The director was likely smiling for the cameras, speaking of courage and pushing the boundaries of science. The scientist leaned back in his creaking chair in the silent, dusty room below. The battle for the soul of his creation had begun, and his opponent didn't even know the war was being fought. What is the true measure of control? The ability to command obedience, or the foresight to command wisdom? The storm hit with the fury of a wounded animal. On the main screen, which stretched 2 stories high, the supercell was a beautiful, terrifying spiral of deep reds and incandescent yellows. The director, a wireless microphone clipped to his lapel, was in his element, narrating the events for the assembled crowd of investors and media. His voice was a smooth, confident baritone, weaving a tale of technological prowess and human ingenuity. The drone swarm, he explained, was performing flawlessly, a testament to the Institute's engineering and his team's skill. For the first hour, his narrative held true. The drones reached the storm system, fanning out into their initial observation pattern, their data streams painting a comprehensive, real-time map of the storm's structure. The director basked in the warm glow of success, smiling for the cameras. Then, with the storm reaching its peak intensity and a clear tornado forming on the ground, he gave the order that would define the mission. "Let's take them closer," he announced, his voice ringing with authority. "I want visuals from the wall of the mesocyclone. Let's show the world what this system can really do." The young team at the controls relayed the command. A hushed anticipation fell over the room. On the screen, the command was shown as sent and then acknowledged by the AI. And then, nothing happened. The swarm of drones continued its wide, stubbornly safe orbit, ignoring the direct order. The director's confident smile tightened. "Run it again," he snapped. The command was sent again. And again, it was acknowledged and ignored. A low murmur rippled through the investors. What is the sound of a multi-billion-dollar project refusing to perform on cue? The lead technician, a young woman with a panicked look in her eyes, turned to the director. "Sir," she stammered, "the AI is classifying the command as a direct violation of something called the Auto-Preservation Protocol. It's overriding all manual inputs. This protocol, it's not in any of our current documentation." The director's face, which had been a mask of cool control, began to crumble. The blood drained from it, replaced by a flush of hot, furious red. The air of confident triumph in the room curdled into one of acute tension and public humiliation. The investors were no longer murmuring. They were whispering into their phones. The media cameras, sensing a story far more interesting than a successful tech demo, zoomed in on the director's strained face. He barked orders at the technicians, his voice losing its smooth charm and taking on a sharp, brittle edge. They typed frantically, trying to find a workaround, to force their way through the AI's defenses, but the system was a fortress. The old scientist had built it too well. Each attempt was met with the same digital response: command denied, protocol violation. Unable to admit that he had been outmaneuvered, or worse, that he did not fully understand the system he claimed to command, the director did what desperate men in power often do. He crafted a new narrative on the spot. He strode to the bank of cameras, his face now a mask of practiced disappointment. He spoke of unforeseen limitations in the system's foundational architecture. He mentioned the challenges of working with legacy code, and how, despite his team's brilliant efforts, the original design was simply not as agile or responsive as modern science required. He never mentioned the scientist's name. He didn't have to. The implication was a poison dart, silent and effective. The fault was not with the new leadership that had failed to perform, but with the old foundation upon which they stood. How do you defend yourself against an enemy who never speaks your name? The scientist, watching the live feed from his home, felt no anger. There was only a cold, quiet vindication as he watched the director's lie, recognizing it for what it was, the desperate move of a king in a chess game he didn't even know he was playing. A week later, a new storm began to form over the plains. This one was different. The first storm had been a textbook supercell, powerful but predictable. This new one was an anomaly, a monster that grew with a malignant speed that defied all existing models. The Institute's conventional forecasting models were struggling to keep up, their predictions lagging hours behind the storm's terrifying evolution. The only tool on Earth capable of accurately tracking it was Project Typhoon, but its safety-first approach meant it could only observe from a distance. The Institute was now facing a crisis far worse than a public relations failure. A potential EF5 tornado was developing, and their multi-billion-dollar system was, by their own aggressive standards, crippled. The director's career, once a rising star, was now on the verge of collapse. The investors were threatening to pull funding, and the government was demanding answers. There was only one person on Earth who could help. The journey was a humbling one. The director drove his expensive sedan away from the gleaming glass tower and into the quiet, tree-lined suburbs where the scientist lived. It was a pilgrimage of desperation. He found the scientist in his garden, calmly tending to his rose bushes. The director, his voice stripped of its usual confidence, laid out the situation. He spoke of the danger, the thousands of lives at risk, the need for the drones to get closer, to get the vital data that could pinpoint the tornado's path. He appealed to the scientist's sense of duty, his legacy. "We need you," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "The system won't listen to us. It's your design. Only you can unlock it. I'm asking you, for the public good, disable the protocols." He offered a new title, full research funding, a public apology, everything he had once taken away. The old scientist continued to carefully prune a rose bush, snipping away a dead leaf before finally turning to face the younger man. He listened patiently as the director exhausted his pleas. Is a plea for help genuine if it is born only of desperation? Finally, the scientist spoke, his voice not angry, but weighted with a calm, surgical precision. "The public good was not your primary concern last week," he stated simply. "Your primary concern was the approval of men who value a stock portfolio more than a scientific paper." And then came the refusal, a statement of principle that sealed the director's fate. "I will not disable the protocol," the scientist said, "because the protocol is not the problem. It is the solution. It is the very thing that will save this project and your career from your own worst impulses. You look at the storm and see a show. I look at it and see a complex system that demands respect, not arrogance. The AI is finally treating it with that respect. That is not failure. That is success. He then laid out his terms, not as a negotiation, but as a statement of fact. He would return to the Institute. He would take command of the mission personally. The director and his investors would be granted access to the visitors' gallery, the very place they had once sent him. They could watch, but they would not interfere. The science, from this moment forward, would be conducted his way. The director, broken and with no other options, could only nod in silent agreement. The reversal was complete. The king had just handed the keys to the kingdom back to the man he had exiled. The return to the control room was quiet. The media and investors were gone, and the young technicians looked at the old scientist with a newfound, almost reverent respect. He did not sit in the director's central command chair, but took a modest side station. From there, with a quiet efficiency that stunned the room, he began to conduct his orchestra. He did not fight the auto-preservation protocol. He worked with it, using its logic to his advantage. He treated the drone swarm not as a single spear to be thrust into the heart of the storm, but as a vast, intelligent net, repositioning them to create a three-dimensional map of the entire weather system. The data that poured in was not the thrilling, chaotic video the director had craved, but something far more beautiful to a true scientist, a complete, elegant, and perfectly rendered picture of the monster in its entirety. The mission was a resounding success. The comprehensive data allowed the AI to predict the tornado's precise path hours in advance, a feat previously thought impossible. The warnings were issued with an unprecedented level of accuracy. When the EF5 tornado finally struck, its terrible power was unleashed upon empty fields and evacuated industrial parks. Property was lost, but not a single life. It was a perfect victory, achieved not through brute force, but through intelligence and wisdom. It generated no thrilling headlines, only a few quiet commendations from the National Weather Service. The director kept his job, but his authority was gone, a hollow shell. The Institute was forced to reevaluate its entire approach, shifting its focus from public relations back to pure research. The scientist, his point having been made, retired for good a few months later, leaving his creation in the hands of a new generation he had personally trained. His legacy was secure, not as a spectacle, but as a quiet, unshakable monument to the principle that in the end, substance will always triumph over style.